Before I begin my presentation, I would like to thank Charles Bevel for inviting me to contribute to the Idea of Iran Symposium, and also Fatima Soudavar, and of course the Soudavar Foundation for their support, and SOAS for hosting the series. And also thanks to Vincenzo and everyone else who has facilitated this virtual border crossing, so to speak. I will be sharing my PowerPoint with you. Okay. On 21st March 2019, I received a text message on my mobile phone from the Iranian president relaying his best wishes for the Iranian New Year. The mass presidential message to Iranian citizens congratulated them on the occasion of Nowruz Alavi, New Year of Ali's follower, a compound that I read with great interest. This year, the last day in the Iranian calendar had coincided with the birthday of the first Shiite Imam. The old year, the presidential message seemed to convey, did not conclude with the birth of Imam Ali, but rather the Shiite celebration marked the beginning of the Persian New Year. Representations of Nowruz as a Shiite celebration is not an unprecedented concept. Hemerological anxieties to reconcile pre-Islamic festivals with events pertaining to the lives of the Shiite Imams are investigated by Safavid jurists such as Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, who traced the genealogy of the Iranian New Year in sayings attributed to the Shiite Imams to establish jurisprudential significance and justifications for celebration of Nowruz. The link between Shiite events and Iranian festivals was also highlighted by pre-1979 Islamic theorists such as Ali Shariati, who flagged up the Safavid's contribution in the construction of the Iranian Shiite identity. When Nowruz and Ashura coincided during the reign of Shah Abbas, as Shariati recounts, the Safavids were faced with a momentous dilemma, which had never been a challenge for the previous rulers of Iran. It was eventually decided that the Safavids should mourn Ashura first and celebrate Nowruz the next day, thus refraining, as Shariati notes, from sacrificing nationality and religion at the expense of one another. However, on checking the conjunction of Ashura and Nowruz throughout the Safavid period, it appears that the first day of Nowruz never coincides with Ashura. The anecdote, however, continues to emerge in post-1979 readings of the Safavid period, mainly to establish that the theopolitical confluence of Iran and Islam in the construction of the Shiite identity was defined by the Safavids. Evidence of such a complex relationship between Iranianness and Shiiteness emerges significantly in encounters with the non-Iranians in Safavid travel narratives. In current scholarship, the study of Safavid travel writing is predominantly limited to European accounts of Iran. The large corpus of travel writing produced by Europeans has led to the assumption that the Safavids were comparatively less preoccupied with travel and travel writing. Safavid travel culture, however, operated through alternative modes of knowledge production. As an instance, prescriptive jurisprudential treatises that address the maintenance of the Shiite identity during mobility through travel rituals indicate that how travel and mobility were embedded in the everyday practices of the Safavids. In the past 2 decades, archival investigations have contributed to our increasing awareness of textual evidence for Safavid travel culture. To the best of my knowledge, there are presently 13 Persian travel narratives available in printed editions, none of which were destined for Europe, and a considerable number of which were composed in poetry. I propose these underexplored travel accounts, particularly those composed in verse, although outnumbered by European narratives, are replete with historical and socio-cultural knowledge to the extent that they should be included in Safavid historiography. Through an ethical engagement with travel texts of the period, we can navigate the vocabulary of Iranian selfhood and sense of self at a distance from home. Looking at Safavid travel culture, it becomes instantly apparent that Hajj supersedes all forms of and incentives for travel, a premise which is underscored in books of Islamic ethics such as Hilyatul Muttaqin. Theoretically, the religiously incentivized Hajj is a journey of self-introspection, less preoccupied representations of the external world. The uniform white ihram attire is meant to erase any sense of superficial distinction among the pilgrims. However, the agential aspects of the Shiite identity and the self-referential terms that emerge significantly in Hajj encounters renders the Hajj as the dynamic site of self-image production. I begin my brief expedition into Iranian selfhood with what at first seems to be an anomalous text, a pilgrimage narrative in verse by a Safavid woman who undertook the Hajj from Isfahan, most probably in the early 18th century, unaccompanied by any male or female relatives. From a little note on the margin of the manuscript, we know that she was widow of Mirza Khalil, the royal scribe at the port of Isfahan. Some scholars have referred to her as the Isfahani lady, and others regard her as the Isfahani widow. However, because her identity as a female traveler and a poet is unique, and further evidence regarding her precise name is unknown, I chose to refer to her as Lady Sarsar, or the Lady of Swift Wings, as she frequently likens her sudden departures from Isfahan and other locations to a cold, harsh wind, Sarsar. In the opening lines of her account, the poet tells us how the cunning wheel of fortune has slashed her liver and separated her from her beloved husband. Since then, what has become jurisprudentially impermissible or haram to her is peaceful sleep that is disrupted by sorrow, for which she sees no cure other than travel. I have worked extensively as a part of my doctoral project on the textual analysis of this underexplored text through the lens of gender in the context of Safavid jurisprudential treatises that related women's mobility. Conventionally, travel narratives opened with gratitude towards God, laudation of Prophet Muhammad, and expressions of allegiance to Shiite imams. Lady Sarsar's narrative of 1,200 rhyming couplets begins in medias res and ends abruptly in Aleppo on her return journey to Iran. References to Shiite imams are, however, interlaced throughout her narrative, emerging significantly in encounters with the Sunni other. As the lady's caravan, which she has joined back in Nakhjavan, threads into Karamanlar for the first time before stepping outside the Safavid borders and into the Ottoman domain, there is anxiety amongst her fellow travelers. Throughout the night, Lady Sarsar and her fellow travelers are aware that come morning, they will no longer traverse in the realms of the Ajams, which is under the jurisdiction of the Shah of Iran, presumably Shah Sultan Hussein. Historically, as Abbas Amanat notes, Ajam is connotative of linguistic condensation and literally translated as one who does not speak discernibly. Perhaps a mockery of the inability of Iranians to pronounce the deep glottal sounds of the Arabic language. The term gradually lost its pejorative meaning, and by the 11th century, it gained currency among the Iranians as a term of ethno-linguistic self-identification, distinguishing themselves from their Arab-speaking neighbors. To the lady's lament, the Iranians who were roaring lions in their own lands are now degraded by the Ottomans to the degree that they must refrain from enunciating the name of God's lion, an epithet of Imam Ali. This precautionary dissimulation or taghiyeh of their faith is also extended to all other noticeable Shiite activity, including the trade of gems, which refers to the tradition of purchasing carnelian stones, strongly recommended as an amulet and a signifier of Shiite fellowship in Safavid jurisprudential treatises. Abstinence from specifically Shiite activities may have also been a preemptive measure of self-protection by the caravan members. Evidence of tensions regarding the treatment of Iranian pilgrims can be traced in epistolary exchanges between Safavid and Ottoman rulers, who, as the custodians of the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina, were responsible for the protection of pilgrims. Due to escalating attacks by road bandits and increasing price of travel taxes, Shah Abbas II once issued a decree forbidding pilgrimage to Mecca on the premise that financial competence and safety were the prerequisites for undertaking the Hajj. Despite the jurisprudential emphasis on abstinence from signifiers of disparity in the state of Ihram for the purpose of fostering fellowship among pilgrims, travelers to Mecca and Medina provide us with the evidence of the contrary. Recounting his memories of the Hajj in La Promesse Pergarani, Muhammad Taqi Majlisi notes how Shiites are immediately identified by the position of their hands during prayers, which they keep to their sides, just as the Malikis, one of the major factions of the Sunni school. If a Maliki does not fold his arm during prayers, Majlisi observes, no one protests against him. But when an Ajam stands in prayer with open hands, even when praying behind a Maliki Imam, the Sunnis conclude that he must be a Rafizi, someone who curses the Caliphs and therefore must be punished, often by death. The denunciatory rituals of Tabara, by means of which the communal self of the Shiites is reinforced, in the eyes of the Sunnis, equated Iranianness with Shiiteness. Another feature which exposes the Shiite convictions of Safavid travelers is the mournful descriptions of the Al-Baqi cemetery, where the bodies of a number of Shiite figures are interred. Lady Sarsar, who is heartbroken by the humble state of the untended cemetery, summons the breeze to carry the message back to Isfahan, addressing the Shah of Iran as the servant of descendants of Ali. She pleads with him to send glorious Iranian carpets, golden chandeliers, and Persian pomegranate trees, in other words, endowments, to the immortal garden of Al-Baqi, in hopes that it may unsettle the rivals of Iran and Shiism. Another specifically Persian element occurs in her encounter with the Kaaba, which emerged like a movement from a distance. Tongue-tied with joy of union, she finds herself incapable of describing the Kaaba, for the Kaaba is more sublime than any word she can possibly think of. Finally, she cautiously succumbs to the limitations of her pen and likens Kaaba to a young man as slender and tall as a Persian cypress, who is clad in a velvet black robe with a golden embroidered sash. The young man has lifted the skirt of his robe up to his waist as though standing up in a sprightly fashion. By contrast, the mid-17th century author of Ejaz Makki, Waheb Hamadani, who composed his account of Hajj in verse, describes the Kaaba as a bride who sits behind a black veil that would eventually protect black-fated sinners before God on Resurrection Day. A specifically feminized representation of the Kaaba in a Safavid dictionary, Farhang Rashidi, indicates that perhaps gendered representations of the house of God were not that uncommon among the Safavids and their predecessors. The curious entry appears as the bride of the Arabs, Arus Arab, and is explicated as the ennobled Kaaba. Conversely, the comparative scarcity of masculine representations of the Kaaba leads us to believe that Lady Sarsar's portrayal of the house of God in masculine terms and through specifically Persian elements is indeed unique, if not subversive. Consciousness of Iran as a theocultural as well as a geopolitical concept also emerges in non-Hajj travel narratives. In the opening lines of Khatwai-Nameh, an early 16th century account of China, the author Ali Akbar Khatwai establishes that there are only a few distinct Muslim realms in the world, Mamlikat Musalmani, Arabistan, land of Arabs, Rum, land of Ottomans, Ajamistan, land of Ajam, which is comprised of the realm of Iran, Mulk Iran, and Turan. These Muslim realms, he writes, are the center of the world, and the infidel, the kuffar, resigned around these distinct borders. Such instances show us that Safavid travelers were conscious of the extent of geographical borders and territorial representations of Iran. Ali Akbar, who is disputably a Sunni, takes refuge in the patronage of the Ottoman Sultan Selim, to whom he dedicates his narrative. He seems to be dedicating his narrative to Sultan Selim. Sunni travelers, particularly those who wrote in the early years of the Safavid rule, tend to reveal more affinity with the Ottoman Empire. Jawdatul Ashiqin, a 16th century Hajj narrative in prose, composed by Sharifuddin Hossein Khwarazmi, describes the pilgrimage of a delegation of 300 Sufis headed by the author's father, Sheikh Kamaluddin, in 1549 from Samarkand through Crimea and Constantinople to Mecca. With the advent of the new Shiite rule and the Iran-Uzbek wars, pilgrims from Transoxania, who were mostly Sunni and Sufi, were compelled to undertake the Hajj from Kharaz to Istanbul via the Mazandaran Sea and or the Black Sea. The Ottomans offered financial support and security to the pilgrims of Transoxania, Hajjaj Mawara, and even built khanqahs and caravanserais en route to Mecca. On the way from Crimea to Constantinople, waiting for the ships to dock, the delegation of 300 Sufis, also employ Ajam as a self-referential term, are compelled to spend the entire night in an unspecified village, which the author refers to as the village of Gabran, non-Muslims, where not even one Muslim could be found to speak with. This is one of the rare instances in travel narratives when Muslimness is equated with linguistic knowledge of Islam, the Arabic language. The author of another early 16th century Hajj narrative in verse, Futuh al-Haramain, composed by Muhyiddin al-Lari. Muhyiddin al-Lari, who is a Sunni, attempts to soothe his longing heart for the Kaaba through the festive rhythms of Nowruz. Lari, who is conscious of the presence of both Arab and Ajam pilgrims in Mecca, acknowledges that neither poetry nor music can pacify his aching heart. but the ways of worship, as codified in the Quran in the Arabic language. The fact that Sunni travelers revealed consciousness about the Arabic language as the language of Islam, while composing poetry and prose in Persian, seems to suggest, by contrast, that Shiite travelers who equated Iranianness with Shiiteness were deliberate in their use of the Persian language. Shiite travelers to India, on the other hand, generally regarded the Safavid rulers as the embodiment of Quran. After conventional prayers to God and invocation of the Prophet, Muhammad Nabi Khurshid's narrative in verse commences with praise of Shah Abbas II, which he regarded as jurisprudentially obligatory, as wajib, as daily prayers and fasting. Muhammad Nabi, who was born in Isfahan, finds himself trapped for 25 years in Hind, a land that he finds jurisprudentially impure, mainly due to idol worship. Perhaps to ritualistically cleanse himself from his long stay in Hind, he sets out on Hajj, shortly after returning to Iran. Even though the Shah is a direct descendant of the Prophet, despite his elevated status as the king of Iran, Muhammad Nabi remarks, he is nothing but a slave, ghulam to Imam Ali. Rome and China shrivel before the elevated state of the Iranian king. The Hind is merely one of the many houses of slaves that Iran owns on the royal chessboard. And yet, such prevalently presumptuous notions of its inherent inferiority do not hinder Iranians from traveling to Hind. The image of Hind is primarily represented as a destination where the Perso-Islamic travelers find themselves due to the slyness of fate. And in their accounts, Hind is regarded as a vertiginous object of desire which they fear and yet for which they want to fall. Their accounts vacillate between the longing to explore the wonders of Hind and the fear of never being able to exit from its monstrosities. The author of Nur al-Mashriqain, Beheshti Harabi, also composed an account of travels in Iran and India in verse. Writing under the patronage of full Prince Murad Bakhsh, Behesht praises Shah Abbas as a descendant of the mythical Persian king Jamshid and regards him as Persian Cyprus in the orchard of Imam Ali. For Beheshti, the Shah is an ethnically proportionate embodiment of the confluence of Iran's glorious pre-Islamic past and the zenith of its Shiite present. He invokes the presence of the Khawans of China and the Caesars of Rome as the hierarchical representatives of the non-Muslim world, to witness the grandeur of the Shah, who is praised by God himself. The poet's loyalty and pledge of allegiance to the Safavid king, whose blessed face he has never seen, but bears love with 1,000 souls, resembles the general tone of the Safavid poets who praise the physical and spiritual aspects of the Shiite imams, whose faces they have never seen. Even though I seek refuge in Hind, he declares, I am an Iranian and a servant to the Shah. Despite his long residence in India, Beheshti's sense of his own Iranian self is immediately equated with his servility towards Shah of Iran as the quintessence of Shiite ethos on earth and the executor of divine decree in the absence of the last Imam. This is one of the few significant instances when travelers equate Iranianness with Shiiteness through the detour of the Safavid kings. Beheshti's account is also remarkable for descriptions of cities in Iran as he negotiates belonging between people and places that he encounters, how each locale bears the attributes of its inhabitants, who defined the socio-cultural borders of that realm. Mashhad and Soudavar are home to the Sadat, the verified male descendants of the Prophet. The people of Semnan are all experts in mathematics, and the people of Shiraz are all poets, as one would expect from a land that was home to canonical figures such as Sa'di and Hafiz. Due to the presence of Imam Riza's shrine, he regards the land of Mashhad to be equally blessed as the land of Karbala. The rise in pilgrimages to Shiite landmarks inside Iran officially expanded the definitions of Shiite topography in the Safavid period and contributed to the notion of Shiiteness being equivalent to Iranianness. Given their overall privileged position as residents of the world of culture and letters, for most travelers of the period, Isfahan is the focal point and lens through which they regard other places and evaluate other places and peripheries. To Lady Sarsar, Aleppo is not only reminiscent of Isfahan, but as the center of earthly resourcefulness and divine hospitality, it's resonant of the entirety of Iran itself. Even a Herati poet such as Beheshti, who celebrates Herat as his hometown, cannot evade the geocultural and political supremacy of Isfahan and dedicates a significant number of verses to the admiration of the city. For Hazin Lahiji, whose autobiography cum travel narrative is set in the context of political turmoil towards the end of the Safavid period, the fall of Isfahan is the fall of Iran as he knew it. Hazin is both an active participant and an empathetic recorder of events during the siege of Isfahan in 1722, and gives an account of noblemen and scholars who died during and before the siege. After a decade of displacement and moving residences across several cities, due to increasing upheaval that led to Nader Shah's rise to power, Hazin was compelled to abruptly leave Iran for Hind in 1734, a decision that he regrets in which respect. To Hazin, who was close to the centers of power, Iran was defined by the Safavids, were the epitome of generosity induced by manliness, morawat, and people-centeredness. Hind, on the other hand, not only did not possess such masculine Sufi attributes, but rather depleted the manliness of Iranian travelers through its exhaustively feminine features. Hind's treatment of Iranian nobility, Hazin notes, predated Islam and emerged in the history of the Majus, the Zoroastrians, notably in the 11th century poet Asadi Tusi's Garshasname, where the Iranian mythical dragon-slaying hero Garshas is advised by Nariman to shorten his stay in India, lest his army loses all sense of manliness and culture. Trapped for nearly 3 decades in Hind, a land that he cannot exit but through death, Hazin Lahiji reminisces about Iran's mythical and residual cultural superiority that surpasses the wonders of Solomon's proverbial ring, which was lost temporarily, but eventually returned to its rightful owner. Hazin wishes that the elevated paradise of Iran Zamin, which is closely linked with the concept of Iran Shar, which emerges in Sasani literature. So he wishes that the elevated paradise of Iran Zamin is immune to the attack of Ahriman. In other words, the An-Iran, non-Iranians, the enemies of Iran, implicitly the Ottomans, the Arabs, the Mughal Indians, those who have their eyes on the mythical ring. For those who possess insight, he writes, Iran is the pearl and the central gem that makes encounters with and discovery of the world's oyster worthwhile. Although these verses belong to Hazin's large poetry compilation and are not a part of his travel narrative, they could be regarded in the larger corpus of Safavid travel literature produced during mobility within and outside Iran. Looking through Safavid travel literature, we can infer that there was an awareness of Iran as a geopolitical body with distinct geographical borders and distinct governance that travelers noted variously in their accounts. Iran appears to be a cultural and political component through which the Persian-Islamic traveler establishes his sense of self, often against what seems to threaten the integrity and entirety of Iranianness, which is again often intertwined with notions of Shiiteness and personified by the Safavid rulers. By examining Iranian and Shiite selfhood through the synergic relationship between travel and identity, the historical and cultural context through which the lived and traversed geography of the Iranian travelers are translated into the literary topography of the Safavids, we can shed light on how Safavid travelers conceptualize a theopolitical and cultural Iran that traveled with them beyond its borders. Thank you.
I'd like to begin this communication by a quotation of one of the famous French travelers in Iran in the second part of the 17th century. I mean Jean Chardin. Jean Chardin is a French jeweler who traveled several times in Iran. He reaches Isfahan in 1666 and soon becomes the personal agent of Shah Abbas II for the purchase of jewels. In 1671, he publishes in Paris a first book entitled The Coronation of Suleiman III, King of Persia. In the introduction, Jean Chardin perfectly describes the mindset of Europeans regarding the Safavid state. We can translate him as following. Among the vast empires of the East, where men have been attracted so far by the most distant climate, either by the curiosity of acquiring new knowledge or by the avidity of enriching themselves, none, in my opinion, cannot replace Persia, both for its climate, for the genius which is more reasonable than elsewhere, and more similar to ours, than for all the excellent and rare things that are abundantly found there. First of all, Iran appears as a powerful and attractive country that aroused the attention and desire of learned elite as well as European merchants. He refers here to a very specific period in Safavid history, which begins with the reign of Shah Abbas I, when monarchical power succeeded in imposing itself against the various factions of the military aristocracy, the Qizilbash, but also against the Ottoman, Mughal, and Uzbek Empire. The establishment of authoritarian power concentrated in the hand of the sovereign then raises fundamental issues about the nature and reality of power in Iran. The Shah appears as an ambivalent figure, a prince with both tyrannical and temperate, reflecting a new conception of monarchical authority. In the mind of Europeans, the Shah represents a king of war, very close to Western models. Chardin particularly stresses this point. Iran is a country that stands out from its immediate neighbors by the refinement of its mores and by its own genius. As a result, it doesn't join, or not totally, the otherness of the other Muslim countries, but comes close that of Europeans, particularly in matter of faith. Political power imposes tolerance as a principle of government. The dominant religion, 12-ver Shiism, is strongly controlled by the state and must coexist with other religions. By drawing the attention of the readers to the well-known qualities of this distant power and its inhabitants, Shah thus participates in the theological and political debates of his time, particularly in France with the reform of the Edit de Nantes. However, the author doesn't claim to original thinking. He is aware that his audience has already had the opportunity to know with these ideas. Long before the publication of his own book, the relations of Pietro della Valle, Adam Olearius, or Don Garcia de Silva y Figueroa benefited from a significant readership in France. In this conference, I'll try to show that these travel stories constitute a privileged field of study for the understanding of Iran in France in the 17th century, but also that their interpretation of the Safavid state reveals questions cut-crossing their societies. My attention will focus on three main areas. First, I'll begin with the development of a model of absolute government represented by the Safavid sovereign. Then, the construction of a positive image of religious tolerance. Finally, the understanding of the Persian lifestyle in France. In the relations of European travelers, the Safavid Shah is often portrayed as an absolute monarch. Their model is, of course, Shah Abbas, as described by Pietro della Valle. Pietro della Valle is one of the most remarkable travelers of the Baroque area. He stays in the Safavid court between 1618 and 1621. After his return in Italy, he published a small book about the personality of Shah Abbas the Great, entitled De la condizione di Abbas re di Persia, which is quickly traduced in French by the scholar Jean Baudin in 1631. In his apologetic history of Abbas, king of Persia, the Italian traveler particularly insisted on the personalization of power in the Safavid court. The Shah holds the first place, directly rules the affairs of the state, and directs the foreign policy. All the members of the court, officers, provincial governors, administrators, are considered as his servants and, through them, the state. Their recruitment relies on the system of favor. Supporter of a strong monarchical power, Della Valle brings out the figure of a profoundly modern prince, a providential man, a guarantor of civil peace, and close to his subjects, a victorious monarch able to impose a new order in society. In the eyes of the Western public, Shah Abbas thus appears as the incarnation of the absolute monarch, who finally places the interests of his country above all other consideration. He also embodies the ambivalence related to the exercise of this authority. Abbas is, I quote Della Valle, a good and righteous but severe master, not being offended if his reputation or interests were tarnished. In fact, the assimilation between absolute power and Safavid monarchy is reinforced throughout the century with the figures such as Shah Safi, Shah Abbas II, and Shah Suleiman, whose French authors like Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, Nicolas Sanson, and Jean Chardin quote, "Symbol of monarchical absolutism, the Shah of Iran is an inexhaustible source of inspiration for French authors and the same artists. As we can see in this print from the second half of the 17th century, Shah Abbas II is portrayed as a true king of war. The print uses all the Baroque visual codes. The king rides a powerful horse and poses as a victorious general at the head of his troops. We can see in the background the city conquered. The text emphasizes this heroic dimension. So we can translate that Shah Abbas, second of the name, king of Persia, great-grandson of this great king Shah Abbas, the terror of the Ottoman arms, succeeded in his father Safavid in the year 1642 on the Persian Empire, and 3 years later declared war against the Mughals, on which he won great victories and made great conquests. This is not a portrait. Facial features don't matter. It's not a person who is represented, but a political agenda. The Shah is supposed to personify the whole monarchy, as well as the glory attached to absolute power. This image is often used in European iconography. As we can see in this engraving of Henry IV by Antonio Tempera, the king appears in majesty, dressed in the finery of power. Antonio Tempera creates, at the end of the 16th century, a new model of equestrian portrait. As Friedrich Pomereux says in a recent article, the engraving is used as a way of propaganda for the French prince. The graver gives to his character a very dynamic position and majesty. One other example. It's an extract of the English version of the relation of Thomas Herbert in the left. And on the right, we can see another portrait of Henry IV. The assimilation between the two kings is quite obvious. Shah Abbas is depicted exactly in the same position as the King of France. The symbolism is quite clear. It makes a link between their practice of sovereignty. Indeed, after a long time of civil war, Henry IV imposes his authority on the elites and restores peace in the state. He triumphs over his enemy, mainly the Habsburg prince, like the king of Persia does on the Ottoman and Mongol emperors. Later artists use the same motif, as we can see with the equestrian portrait of Louis IV and Shah Sultan Hussein in the last part of the 17th century. Each time it's a question of showing a more or less favorable aspect of this new conception of royal power. The image of the Safavid ruler thus allows to feed a debate properly French, even European, on the rise of monarchical absolutism. But the idea of Iran also allows us to understand the debate on religious tolerance as it arises in France on the eve of the revocation of the Edict Nantes in 1685. In modern times, the notion of tolerance has a significant semantic shift. First, it's perceived as the acceptance of an evil that cannot be prevented. It becomes a more positive notion in the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, with Protestant and Roman Catholic writers who see it as a way of preventing violence related to religious conflict. For the Protestants, Henri de Beauval, recently studied by Sarah Gravelot, tolerance is the only manner of finding peace in the kingdom and creating a positive emulation of competing religion. Its application should glorify the Sun King in Europe, showing that he respects his subjects and sought to make them happy. The question of tolerance is therefore at the heart of the theological debate of the second half of the 17th century. Some of our authors, of our travelers, in particular Jean Chardin, Nicolas Sanson, and Gabriel de Chinon, make also their contribution by proposing an alternative model, Safavid Iran, where political power imposes tolerance towards religious minorities. Since the 1610s, some Christians in Iran, benefit from special privileges. The Armenian community of New Jolfa has freedom of conscience as well as worship and are considered subject of full right. The question here isn't to discuss the reality of this affirmation, mostly false, but to think about the European perception. According to Nicolas Sanson, this tolerance is a real political choice expressing the sovereignty of the prince. Mentioning Shah Suleiman, he says, I quote, "He loves Christians and doesn't want them to be worried about religion. He disapproves that they are forced to make them Mohammedans." Chardin also thinks that Shah Abbas II has a similar wish because, I quote, there was only God who was the master of consciences and the king of wills. He's even more enthusiastic. He presents the Shah as an advocate of peace and security of his subjects. He isn't the only one who insists on the benefits of civilian tolerance in Iran. Catholic writers also make it a tool to the glory of the Safavid ruler. Thus, the memory of Shah Abbas II is celebrated by all the Christians of Isfahan. The Christians who had the happiness of being his subjects are crying him secretly today as if he were not only their king, but their father. As his justice and his goodness allowed them not to be violated nor disturbed for their religion, the exercise of which was preserved to them quite freely. According to Chardin, tolerance can also be useful to the state. King Shah Abbas II, by guaranteeing peace in the interior, also brings great prosperity to the country. Armenians become the richest merchant in his country. He insisted on the fact that Iran also attracts commercial companies from around the world as well as the wealth of neighboring countries. Tolerance is presented here as a way to improve the image of the ruler and increase his prestige. Above all, it brings to the reader a crucial idea. The true glory of a monarch isn't to impose a religious unity in his states, but to ensure the happiness of his subjects. In this regard, the Iranian rulers are presented as role models, particularly for Louis XIV, who proclaimed the reestablishment of the unity of faith with the revocation of the Edict Nantes by the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. However, the call for religious tolerance launched by our travelers will not be followed by effect. Chardin himself had to leave France after the revocation and found refuge in England. But the idea of tolerance involved at the same time. So, it's not a coincidence that Montesquieu poses a crucial question in introduction of the Persian later. How can one be Persian? He is an attentive reader of travel relation, in particular that of Chardin. The philosopher feels a great affinity with this distant society and recognizes himself in the civility used at the Safavid court. Civility is a strong word in the France of the last part of the 17th century. It's a part of the politeness culture, and it gathers the elite. The French scholar Antoine Furtière describes it in this first dictionary as the honest, sweet, polite way to talk, to act, or to talk together. This obviously raises the question of the connection between these two parts of humanity. Is a feeling of proximity, even affinity, expressed by the French authors with regard to the Safavid real? As Romain Bertrand has shown in his remarkable book L'Histoire à parts égales, the acceleration of international exchanges encouraged the rapprochement between different social categories. The French and other European travelers, often from the bourgeoisie, spent a lot of time with the Safavid elite. They are introduced thus to Iran in a circle that they was rarely allowed to approach in their own country, that of the court. Watchful observers of the Safavid elites that they frequent for their business or for their personal pleasure, draw up an edifying picture of their way of being. I quote, Persians have an alert mind, vivacity, refinement, judgment, and prudence, without resorting to the brutal ferocity of the Turks, nor to the vulgar ignorance of the Indians, between whom their country is situated. Their habits are calm and civil, and their mind has capacity and enlightenment. So, the general character of Iranians appears very moderate in the discourse of Europeans. They are not as exotic as the Indians or as cruel as the Turk. In many aspects, their attitude seems to be polite and civilized. They are gallant, nice, polite, gentle, Chardin said. He describes this very well in another sentences. I will say it again. The Persians are surely the most civil people in the world. They have the most touching and engaging manners, the most adaptable minds, and adjust the most quickly and easily. They have the smoothest and the most flattering tongues and avoid making allusions in the conversation or saying anything which could recall or arouse sad ideas. In brief, all that characterize the refined manner of the French society seems to be in use in Iran. Moreover, some authors established direct comparison of both societies. The French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, author of a book entitled Les 6 voyages de Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, écuyer, baron d'Aubonne, qu'il a fait en Turquie, en Perse et aux Indes pendant l'espace de 40 ans, explicitly say, to say that in one word, Persia is for Asia, what is France is for Europe. For the best and for the worst, I imagine. For the German traveler Adam Olarius, traduced in French by Abraham de Wickford in the second half of the century, the comparison is as obvious, but less flattering. No, sorry. Persia has I quote Adam Olarius, Persia has in common with France, as well as many other things, in that very few of their poets have succeeded in drama, and with the exception of a minority of poets of fine reputation, the others are capable of arousing our pity. Anyway, this meticulous attention specific to Iranian attitudes, described on the model of the perfect courtier or honest man, is crucial to understand Iran in France in the 17th century. The travel stories are then intended to a readership composed of scholars and gentlemen, most of whom are eager to find models in travel relationships to improve their own education and good manners. These few remarks allows us to conclude on the importance of Iran's understanding in France in the second half of the 17th century. Although the France didn't finally have much diplomatic or commercial contact with the Safavid power, the latter nevertheless offered a convenient example for invoking relevant topics. First, the rise of monarchic absolutism, perceived both as a threat and an opportunity for the king's subjects. Then, the issue of religious uniqueness within modern societies. And finally, the civility, seen as a way of behaving well in society. It's undoubtedly the richness of these topics that explains the huge success of travel relations to Persia with the French public. Thank you very much.
Not making a pun, the Europeans that came to Iran in the 16th and 17th century had no idea about it. And I will only talk about three nations, the Portuguese, the English, and the Dutch, who came in sequence to Iran. And I've added the Portuguese not because their trade was anything important, but if I wouldn't include them, you would say, well, what about the Portuguese? Anyway, so they are there. Now, I want to answer three questions. Now, why the hell, if they didn't know anything about it, why the hell did they come to Iran? What did they expect? And what did Iran, or they thought, what Iran would offer? Secondly, once they were there, what was the nature and composition and significance of these commercial contacts? And third, was the content and substance of these relations of such a nature that it allowed them to form an opinion about Iran? But before I talk about them, I will some facts about the Iran itself. You know, Iran was not an economy as we know it. And in fact, according to economists, they would say in those times, as an economy, it didn't exist. It was basically 9, 10 different economies. I mean, people in Isfahan could have so much harvest on the field that they didn't even bother to reap it, while people in Khorasan could die and it could not be transported because of lousy transportation system and a lack of sufficient beasts of burden. It was too costly. As I said, you know, we don't know, of course, because there are no statistics available apart from some impressionistic data, but probably 20% of the population lived in urban areas of 5,000 inhabitants or more. 60% lived in villages, and another 20% were nomadic. These figures may have changed over time, depending on what time of the the 250, 30 years or so that the Safavids are in power. 90% of people, in one way or another, earn their money through employment related to agriculture. Although 80% were directly, even people in the urban areas made money from agriculture because that was the mainstay of the economy. And it was a subsistence economy. Most farmers just produced enough to get by and a little bit more to pay the taxes. In short, Iran was a dirt poor, backward and pre-capitalist economy. Let's be no doubt about it. Its imports were mainly for consumption, not for any productive use, mostly. And most of them were for transit to the Ottoman Empire and Russia. The amount that was imported was just too much for local consumption. In fact, that's the way Iran earned hard cash in order to pay the imports from India, where it ran a trade deficit on the balance of payments. In fact, often it had not enough to export to India and made up the balance in hard cash. So it had very few exports that the Europeans might be interested in. And so as I said, India and Ottoman Turkey were its most important trading partners, whereas, let's say, at the end of the 17th and beginning 18th century, Russia started becoming more important. Okay, so we got Iran out of the way, and we can focus on these bloody Europeans. Now, we have the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese organization that ran the show in Asia was the so-called Estado da India. Well, as the term already, when your Portuguese is of course perfect, it means the state of India. It was basically an extension of the Portuguese state in India. And therefore, the leader of the Estado was the viceroy. He was the voice of the king. Now, the objective of the Estado was not commercial at all. It was political. And that already tells you something about the nature of what's going to come. The Estado itself was not involved in any trade. That was left to the private sector, whether it was Portuguese or Asian. It basically installed a system of control over the trading pattern. It disallowed the trade in what is considered strategic goods, like iron and pepper, and what was only allowed to people who had the right to do so. And other people that wanted to trade got the right but had to pay. They bought these cartadas, basically permission to trade, and that was controlled at the high seas and didn't always give you protection, by the way. If a Portuguese needed money, it took it anyway. And so allowed, let's say, the normal trading pattern as it existed prior to their takeover of control over the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean to continue. The English East Company that was established in 1600 came about because of what happened in Europe, in particular the Dutch-Spanish wars, which limited the export of English woolens. And the exchequer, as a consequence, suffered. And therefore, they needed new markets to export, and it was good for employment because a lot of people in England were employed in the woolen trade. So you got the Russia company that made several travels in the 60s and the 1560s, 70s with Iran, were mostly a failure, but at least they got a sniff of it and also found out, hey, raw silk might be an interesting export product. When it was finally formed, and I say once again, explicit objective to bring money back to the UK, or rather at that time just England and Wales, it did not have a monopoly of trade in Asia. And that's what bedeviled the East India Company throughout the ages, because at times other people were allowed to trade as well with Asia. like in the Courtney Company in the 1640s, and then the New Company in the 1690s. Over time, towards the end of the 17th century, the East India also grew into a state, but the royal court still continued to exercise its influence over anything the company decided, unlike, for example, the Dutch company, which I will move to right now. The VOC was created by the state in 1502, basically as a commercial military enterprise. Its focus was, of course, mainly trade, but also, let's say, to harm Spanish and Portuguese interests in Asia. And the VOC, it means United East Indies Company, was a state with a hierarchical structure. The Governor General was in charge, although he was subject to the decisions of the Gentlemen 17 of the Board of Directors. And they were separate from the Dutch Republic. Unlike, let's say, the Estado de India or the East India Company, if you didn't like what had been decided in Goa or in Bombay, you could appeal to the court or the Board of Directors and have it changed. The Dutch East India Company, impossible. Once Batavia had decided whatever the Dutch state wanted to do, it was impossible to do. As I said, it was a state-backed military entity to wage war on Spanish-Portuguese interests. It was also the first, you could say, multinational company. It tried to control the entire trading cycle from production to even retail sale in some cases, and also tried to re-establish the trading patterns all through Asia. Now, okay, why the hell did the Portuguese come there? Well, they came actually by pure chance. The Albuquerque was in Socotra. It was all about pepper. Pepper, before the Portuguese came, went to the Red Sea. The Mamluks controlled that, and sorry, yeah, sorry about that. Sorry about that. I hope you hear me now. Okay. So they wanted to stop the normal trading pattern through the Red Sea, and they were blockading at the time. They ran out of food supplies and water. And so Albuquerque decided to go to Hormuz, because they knew about that through their contacts in Calicut. And I think he had in his back of his mind to do what he did anyway, and basically took control over the Batna coast of Oman and over Hormuz itself. He couldn't stay because his captains disagreed that what he had done. And he said, this is not what the Almeida, who was at the time the Governor General, wanted. He wanted basically not involved in political things at all. And so they left, and the Albuquerque was forced to return to India as well. And in fact, he was for a time imprisoned. But in 1509, he became Governor General. And his king, Manuel I, had a dream. He wanted to be king, the most Christian king of Europe, by conquering Jerusalem. And the Albuquerque said, I'm going to help you realize that. And when he finally established a Portuguese protectorate over the Hormuz kingdom in 1515, he had these four objectives. So to secure Goa, because at the time he had conquered in 1510, he had conquered Goa and made it the capital of the Estado. The distributive role of the Persian Gulf for horses to the Deccan, which was a very important strategic military trading item. Only the Portuguese were allowed to trade in that, nobody else. Then secondly, to eliminate the alternative spice route via the Persian Gulf to the Levant. Third, to get finances for the planned exhibition to the Red Sea and take Aden, which was, again, to strengthen Portuguese control over the spice trade. And then four, to stop Safavid expansionist activities in India and the Persian Gulf, because when he had taken Goa, the Safavid ambassador to the Deccan had come there, and he said, oh, we don't want these guys there. And also when he was in Hormuz, the Safavids came there, and he said immediately he wanted to put a stop to that. In fact, he sent immediately an embassy to Ismail I and said, okay, you know, we have a common interest, and it is getting Jerusalem out of the hands of the Ottomans. And although they didn't have it at the time, it was only 2 years later. But anyway, from the Mamluks at that time. But there was a dream, by the way, that was not only held by the Portuguese, as of that time. You have a series until the end, actually, of the 17th century of European ambassadors all the time trying to get Iran being the dagger in the back of the Ottomans, helping the Christian cause in Europe. Okay. Try to remember this. Okay. Now, what did the Portuguese do and what they didn't do? As I said earlier, they didn't trade the trading patterns in the Persian Gulf at all. They allowed everyone, with the exception of the strategic goods, to trade as they had done before. And as a result, we see, you know, from a few hard statistical data we have of people trading there, Portuguese only were 10% of traders in Hormuz. The majority were Indian, either from Jew or from Gujarat, in particular. Malabar also was, but mainly from Jew and Gujarat. What we also see that despite the fact that they wanted to control the pepper trade, as is usual, once you have established the business, corruption sets in over time. So after you see that increasingly Portuguese, often with the connivance of the captain of Hormuz, started smuggling pepper into the Persian Gulf, which enriched the captain, of course. What is also very interesting, despite the fact that the Portuguese itself, including private capital, didn't have that much interest in the Persian Gulf or Persian trade in general, Hormuz, and after it had been conquered by Iran and the Portuguese established a trading post in Kong, both of them, Hormuz before 1622 and Kong, roughly speaking after the 1660s, became the most important cash source for the Estado de India. And I come back to the cash problem later. Because they first wanted to establish after 1622 themselves in Muscat, but because of the war with the Arabs, Muscat was a drain on their resources, and they were actually quite glad to be rid of it. Although the trade with Kong grew, especially pearl trade. In fact, next to Bahrain, Kong was the major center of pearl trade in the second half of the 17th century. The Portuguese also had made a deal with Iran when they concluded a ceasefire in 1628, that they would get the half of the customs, but they hardly ever got it, and that is a theme that will reoccur in my talk. Okay, now the English. As I told you, the Dutch-Spanish War in particular and other changes in the European economic and political scape hampered British exports, and it became a poor country. And therefore the Persia voyages were specific to sell cloth. In fact, the charter of the East India Company specifically states, I can't remember exactly, I didn't look it up, but 10% of their annual turnover should represent the sale of cloth. And also, because the guys who were doing the actual work were traders, they saw a good market for raw silk. And all of that should benefit the English economy, I should say. And well, the English had one problem. In Asia, you know, if you wanted to buy silk and that other stuff, you needed spices or cotton fabrics. Unfortunately, the English were barred from the Spice Islands by the Dutch, and they were also thwarted in India by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch. And so they had very little access to these to spices and cotton fabrics. And they but the other option was that you had cash, of which they had damn little. So, and at the same time, they were confronted with a rather little demand for English cloth. That's the reason, actually, why they started also trading with Iran, because they couldn't sell much in India. But in Iran, there was a ready market, because it was one of the problems they also faced. The Levant company was selling the stuff in the Ottoman lands, and the Armenians then imported it and brought it to Iran. So there was another problem. So the East India Company had really high hopes that for this important condition in the charter for the selling of cloths, that Iran would bail them out. But as I said, you know, they were throughout the 17th century, they were bedeviled by constant lack of cash. They had no access to spices except for pepper, which they could get in Malabar, especially after they had made peace with the Portuguese in, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, 1637 or so. And of course, in the beginning, until 1620, Portuguese control over Hormuz. That's why when they made their first trip in 1617, they went to Yazd and then overland to Isfahan and back again. Although unbeknownst to the board of directors of the East India Company, the captains in 1622 decided to help the Iranians taking Hormuz, and they hoped at that time that they would be not only the new but the big kids on the block. In fact, the Dutch ran away with the benefits of that conquest. Well, you know, it's a very complicated history how the English company ran its business. It was not a joint stock company. Every voyage had to be financed separately. There was constant bickering between the agents. There had lack of cash and a lot of other problems. We can talk about a bit later. What basically really did them in when, because of the Dutch-English War in 1652 and 54, they ran into the Dutch fleet in Bandar Abbas and they were utterly defeated. And that basically meant the end of a chance of British control, or English control, I should say, over the Gulf. In fact, the Dutch dominated trade and the Gulf throughout the Safavid period and thereafter. At the end of the 17th century, they tried to make a comeback by making a deal with some Armenian merchants, but that didn't pan out. And so basically in the 1690s, they came to the conclusion that their old dream of taking control of the cloth trade by eliminating the influence of the Levant Company and of the silk trade, it was totally failed. In fact, we'll see also that the same held for other traders. Now, excuse me, 5 minutes. Okay, I will be quick. Okay, but the Dutch went there for silk, but they wanted to be part of their trading pattern. They made a contract with the Shah, with what later renewed, And as I said, they controlled trade. There was hardly any export from Iran because the Dutch, once they got Bengal silk, lost interest in Persian silk, and they basically, that held also for the English, by the way, what they exported was cash. That was the most important thing. The Asian merchant, very interesting enough, dominated the textile trade. I forget about this. Okay, here. The context of the English and the Portuguese had no contact at all. The English and the Dutch contacts were formal and of an outwardly polite nature. When you read the correspondence, it is 90% about trade, because they were traders, and they, even when they are beaten up, which sometimes happened, they barely ever say something nasty. They stay very factual about things. They are not very polemical in their, because their directors were not very much interested in either. They want to make money, but so sometimes you find something. Basically, they found Persians haughty, untrustworthy, corrupt, and the government tyrannical. In a letter in the 1660, the English agent said, "The Persian is a nation as full of words and compliments as scarce of good deeds and performances." That's a little bit different than the French. Well, of course, they were doing business and it had to do with real life. So, in summary, the Portuguese didn't come to the Persian Gulf to get anything from Iran. They wanted to prevent spices to go via the Gulf to Europe, and to achieve that, they needed control of Hormuz, and also to deny the Safavids to get hold of the kingdom. The English became, because they needed more revenues, and one way to do that was to seek new markets for their woolens. The Dutch came explicitly for Persian raw silk, to supply silk for the manufacturing industry in Amsterdam. The Estado didn't trade at all with Iran, and apart from shipping of spices and strategic goods, did not interfere with existing trade. The English first tried to trade with the Shah and then with private traders. The EEC lacked Asian commodities to pay for silk and specie, and thus traded mostly non-monopoly goods, and unwittingly developed a country trade through private trade of its own factors, competing with Indian traders. And that basically was the survival of the East India Company and the key to its success in the 18th century. The VOC traded through the sale of Indonesian spices, Taiwanese and Bengal sugar, Japanese copper, tin from Malacca, coffee from Mocha, and fabrics from all over India, and financed the purchase of silk and ready money. The Portuguese had very little interaction with Persians. The English and Dutch merchants more so. However, these contacts with Persia were formal and limited to a number of courtiers and local merchants, with contact was mostly business-oriented in nature. More intimate and freer relations existed with Armenians and other Europeans. They drank a lot, by the way. In short, the scope for these European merchants to come form a notion about Persia was rather skewed. Oh, it was rather skewed, yes. And as I said, let me see what I said here in what I wrote. And although there was awe of luxuriousness of the Persian court, there was little interest in Persian culture. While, as I said, Persians were considered haughty, untrustworthy, corrupt, and the nature of government tyrannical and despotic. Thank you very much.